This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Hello and welcome to this spectacular edition of our Critical Thought here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. Before you say anything, I guess I'm dressed up as a video game analyst with his own YouTube channel and 879 subscribers here on it. How do I know I'm dressed up? Because when I went for my walk earlier this evening, I got candy. So apparently I was dressed up for Halloween. For today's Critical Thought, it's going to be a little bit different, as I'm going to be focusing on horror, which is a topic we've talked about several times in the past. And because of that, this one's going to be a little bit more rambly, or a little bit longer, possibly, than my other ones. Normally, I adhere to a very loose rule of about 10 to 15 minutes per Critical Thought, but seeing it's Halloween, we may take things further. So, to begin with, for those of you who've been following Game Wisdom for years now, you've probably, or hopefully, have listened to several of our casts talking about horror design and my own experience with horror. For those of you who haven't, well, this will be all new to you. Basically, when I grew up, I was really afraid of horror. It was something that I avoided. Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street gave me nightmares. I had, of course, growing up the Nightlight, and I was terrified, and you're going to love this, completely terrified of The Adventures of Lolo for the Nintendo. This was way back, I think, 3 years old. Since then, leg surgeries and just growing up have completely reversed that trend. These days, it is very hard for me to get scared. And like I've said in previous ones, I've played games like Amnesia, and I think I almost fell asleep during it. Five Nights at Freddy's bored me really bad. And I just don't find a lot of modern horror to be all that terrifying. Now, the example up there, of course, is from one of my favorite horror movies of all time, John Carpenter's The Thing. Or, I'm sorry, the remake of The Thing from Another World, for those of you who know about that one. Horror for both video game or in other mediums, in my mind, there are two parts of it that are universal for it and one that's unique for games. We'll start with the common ones. The first one is the villain or the antagonist. We've talked about this multiple times. I've written so many posts about it. And a good antagonist is critical for any kind of horror experience. During the 80s was the height of having the antagonist being like the star, whether it's Freddy Krueger, Mike Myers, Pinhead, Leprechaun, you name it. And one of the things I really liked about those movies is how the antagonist really does enjoy their role. People like Robert Englund, Warwick Davis. I want to say Doug Bradley was the name of the actor who played Pinhead, but it's been a very long time since I looked that up. But you can tell that they were having a lot of fun playing it. And of course, the actor who sadly passed away who played the tall man in the Phantasm series. A good antagonist is something that should be actively chasing the main character, should be a presence in the movie. One of the things that we've seen with a lot of modern horror is how the antagonist is rarely in it. They may have maybe 3 to 4 minutes total of actual appearance. And the rest of it, of course, is, visual tricks, jump scares, stuff like that. When you look at something like I always get Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street confused for some reason. But when you look at Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger is pretty prevalent throughout the entire movie. Every time there's a kill, he's going to be on screen. There's no, random jump cuts or, someone just attacking the person from off screen. He's usually the one doing it. Another essential part of horror is the setting or situation, and John Carpenter's The Thing definitely has that in spades, with a group of researchers stuck in Antarctica, unable to know who to trust, as any of them could be one of those things. And as a complete tangent, I just love the practical effects of the thing. I think that still is an amazing movie. I think that's also why I've gotten a little bit tired of modern horrors, which focus more on CGI. But talking about CGI versus practical, that's beyond the scope of even this special edition of the Critical Thought. A good setting, in my mind, really takes you into the situation, or takes you into the experience. And we've seen some really good examples of this in video games, even in games that weren't really aimed at horror, or at least focusing on it. BioShock being a really good example of exploring Rapture, completely desolated and destroyed. And another really good one would be from the Thief series. I think it was Thief 3, where you have to sneak around a deserted orphanage while the ghosts of the caretakers were wandering around hunting you down. And environmental design is environmental and sound design are such big parts of this. I talked about, of course, Fatal Frame having, random noises that can pop up and freak you out. Even just like noises, like, things bumping in the night. And one thing that I didn't mention that I want to bring up for this one, for me, I think one of the most terrifying things is complete silence. I'm talking pin dropping, not even like crickets or the wind blowing. For some reason, that's always unnerved me, and I think it still lasts to this day. I sleep with a fan on every night because I need that white noise to sleep. But you can really tell the difference between a survival horror and an action horror game based on the music that it uses. For me, good survival horror should have very little music. It should rely mostly on the sound effects, walking, your footsteps, even like the wood cracking, and the house settling. And then when you look at action horror, there's usually like a death metal soundtrack blaring at you while monsters are chasing you. Now, of course, like with a game like Doom, that was to add to the fact that that wasn't really a horror game. But when you see games that are trying to be horrific and they just, blast music at you, it just ruins it. Now, the part that is unique about video games, and this is one that we've touched on in previous critical thoughts and writings on the site, is are the player's options. What do you have access to in this game? And again, we can look at this in a lot of different ways, whether it's being able to set up traps, item usage, even just flat out fighting enemies, like Alone in the Dark when you're punching zombies. I need to take a quick sip. There we go. And it's kind of interesting about the different degrees or the different uses. And the player's options are also very dependent on the enemies they're facing. In Dead Rising, for instance, yes, you're fighting zombies, but they are very slow, and they just basically scream, throw an explosive at me. On the other hand, you have something like the alien in Alien Isolation, who, if he spots you, you're dead. If you try to run, you are dead. If you hide, you'll survive for a few minutes, then you're dead. And it's very important to give the player options. As I talked about in a previous critical thought about fight versus flight, the player needs to have some kind of control over the situation. If all they can do is run or die, then it just makes things so binary that it's hard to feel scared. It's one of the things that took me out of the experience with Outlast and Five Nights at Freddy's. Another thing that I think pulls you out, or at least pulls me out, is when the game becomes intentionally frustrating, whether it is because you run out of batteries in Outlast, or a camera that has a trouble focusing on things. And there's a very interesting debate about horror games, if it's alright to have intentionally frustrating controls. The infamous Resident Evil tank controls being a good example of this. And this is one of those things that kind of started that division between survival horror and action horror. Is when we got to action horror, the controls started to improve a lot, focusing on third-person shooting with games like Alan Wake, Dead Space, which was even carried over to series like Uncharted and Gears of War. And some people say that bad controls are supposed to represent you controlling someone who's weak. It's what they use in Haunting Ground, Rule of Rose, Silent Hill, and who knows how many indie horror games. But for me, I just find that takes me out of the experience. If I'm busy fighting the controls, then I'm not really going to be focusing on something trying to kill me. And it's one of those things that I'm curious for those of you watching. What do you think about those kinds of controls? Yay or nay? Now, a few random bits I want to just bring up about horror. I think one of the things that always freaked me out, I'm sure it's freaked most of you out, is when we got to see, body horror, Cronenberg stuff, something that looks human but is most certainly not. And there's always that fine line between making something that is so unrealistic that it's hard to be scared, and something that looks just real or just human enough that it's like, oh my god, what the hell am I staring at? Something like that lovely face that you've been looking at for about 11 minutes now. And we've seen so many different takes on that kind of design in the horror genre, be it the Deadites of Evil Dead, Cenobites of Hellraiser, and of course so many different zombie models from who knows at this point how many zombie movies there actually are. But one of the things about good horror design, for a video game point of view, is that it's really about that combination of elements. You need to have a good setting, there has to be good enemy design, and of course the player needs to be able to do something. And I think with one of the things we've seen with video games is that they tend to focus on the environment and the enemies for the most part, but they leave the player off, that's 5th or 6th down on the list. When I played, for instance, a game like Dead Space, it is a horrific situation, but this would be an example of a game where they just focus too much on enemy design, where it's just, wave after wave of enemies, and it felt more like Doom than it did Resident Evil. Now, one thing that I wanted to touch on, this may be the last piece for today, and it's something that I really haven't seen a lot of, and for those of you watching this, I'm kind of curious if there are more examples. And what I'm thinking of are essentially hide-and-seek horror games, where there aren't, waves of enemies, there's no super or high action. It's just the player dealing with one or a small number of mega threats. Now, I already know a few examples of this that come to mind. Haunting Ground for the PlayStation 2, the Clock Tower series, and I think there was a third one, but it is not coming to me. Maybe it will hit me in the next minute or so. But what I want to see is horror that deals more with the intimacy of the situation. Again, nothing like Dead Space, where you must save the day or the entire human species is dead. Or later Resident Evil games where you're fighting a mega corporation that plans on taking over the world and killing us all, kind of thing. This goes back to talking about the setting of the horror, and I think some of the best horror situations are when it's low key, where it takes place in a set situation or a set locale, rather than some global or globe-spanning epic story. Again, one of the things that worked with John Carpenter's The Thing was it was constrained to the Antarctic base. Something like Prince of Darkness was an apartment complex. And even Hellraiser kept within a very small locale. Now, Hellraiser, the later ones kind of bucked that trend, but that's for another time. But it's always good to have more of an intimate situation between the player and the enemy. I think that makes things more interesting, and more importantly, it lets the developers get away with more tools or more options. Because if you give the player too many options in an action horror game, then it just becomes too easy. Dead Space got to the point where it was more about coming up with witty dialogue for using your railgun rocket launcher than it was about being terrified of being trapped in a room with the necromorphs. But when it's just you and one very powerful enemy and you're trying to figure out how to deal with them, then you can get creative with the options. Excuse me. A semi-example of this would be something like the stealth battle from Batman Arkham City, where even though that's not a horror situation, it was more about a one-on-one fight that had to be solved creatively. You couldn't just run at Mr. Freeze. Just like in a horror game, you're not supposed to, run headfirst into Jason and punch him in the face. You have to be creative about that. Now, another part about horror that I just remembered is the idea of a cooperative-based horror experience. And we've been seeing some examples of that lately, such as Left 4 Dead, Evolve, Dead by Daylight, and the upcoming Friday the 13th game. And for those of you watching, I'm curious what you think about those games. Like the idea of an asymmetrical co-op experience where one person is the killer. Is this still considered horror, or is it just more, if it's still just more or less like a team-based multiplayer game? I still haven't played too many of those outside of the Left 4 Dead series, but for those of you who have played them, I know Friday the 13th isn't out yet, but Dead by Daylight I think has been out for a while now. What do you think of those games in terms of generating horror? But I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I have things to do tonight. I didn't say this at the beginning, but once again, thank you to 879 subscribers here on YouTube. If you've been enjoying the content, thank you so much for sticking around. Be sure to subscribe, as we are a stone's throw away from 900 subscribers. And then just one more 100 till we get to 1,000. For the 800 Let's Play vote, I'll keep you guys in suspense one more day. We'll announce that for tomorrow's Critical Thought. And you have only a few hours left by the time this goes up to donate to the Patreon campaign for the month of October. And again, those early bird rewards are going away by midnight. So be sure to get them in. And if not, we'll just have the regular pricing. But otherwise, that's going to do it for this Halloween edition of the Critical Thought. Hope you enjoy my little friend here from Shin Megami Tensei again. And this little skull thing I got from Diablo 3. Once again, I hope that guy doesn't fall. Once again, I'm Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Thanks again for watching, and be sure to check back tomorrow for more great content here and on GameWisdom.com. Happy Halloween, and talk to you then. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.